I am a 37-year-old woman, and for most of my life, I lived with a hollow ache in my chest, where a father's love should have been. My name is Lila, though to him I might as well have been nameless. My dad never called me daughter. Not once. Not when I was a little girl trying to braid my own hair and waiting for him to notice me. Not when I was a teenager, who craved even a stern word of concern. Not even when I became a woman carrying his blood in my veins. But never once feeling like I belonged to him. I grew up in a house where silence carried more weight than words. My mother, Maria, was soft-spoken and careful, the kind of woman who always walked on eggshells without ever admitting why. My father, Richard, was the opposite, loud, commanding, and deeply respected by everyone outside our walls. He was a successful man. People would stop him on the street just to shake his hand. Neighbors spoke of his generosity, and at church, he was the man everyone admired. But at home to me, he was a stranger who carried disappointment in his eyes every time they landed on me. I was 7 years old when I asked him once, "Daddy, do you love me?" He didn't even look up from his newspaper. He just said, "Don't be silly. Love isn't something you ask about." That was the closest I ever got to a declaration from him. Not daughter, not sweetheart, not even my name. Just a shrug, a dismissal. And I learned early that if I wanted affection, I'd have to find it elsewhere. As the years passed, the distance between us became a canyon. My brother Caleb was his pride and joy. Caleb could do no wrong. He was taller, stronger, smarter, or so my father said. I can still remember the way Dad's chest would swell with pride when Caleb hit a baseball over the fence, while my piano recitals and art projects were met with polite claps, then forgotten as soon as the applause died down. I wasn't the son he wanted. I wasn't even the daughter he could pretend to be proud of. That truth dug into me like a thorn I could never pull out. I carried it into my 20s, then into my 30s. Every failed relationship, every rejection, every voice in my head that told me I wasn't enough, somehow they all sounded like his. And yet, despite it all, I never stopped hoping. Isn't that the cruelest thing about family wounds? No matter how deep they cut you, some part of you still aches for healing. When my mother passed away unexpectedly, I thought maybe, just maybe, grief would soften him. That standing beside her grave together, we might find some way to bridge the decades of silence. But he stood stiffly in his black suit, tears never once reaching his eyes, and when I leaned into him for comfort, his arm hung limp at his side. Caleb, of course, was the one he leaned on. Caleb, the golden child, whispered in his ear and took his hand as if I didn't even exist. For years after that, I tried to let go. I built a life of my own. I started my own graphic design business. I traveled. I found friends who loved me like family. But the ache of being unseen by your own father doesn't disappear just because you grow older. It lingers in every corner of your life. And as much as I tried to move on, I knew there was unfinished business between us, questions I needed, answered truths I had never been brave enough to demand. Then came the call. Caleb's voice low and heavy telling me, "It's Dad." He doesn't have much time. I should have felt relief, maybe even indifference. After all, what did this man ever give me except silence? But when I hung up the phone, I felt something else, a storm rising in my chest. Because if he was going to leave this world without ever once calling me his daughter, then I needed to look him in the eye before he went and tell him what his silence had done to me. When I arrived at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the steady beep of machines filled the air. He looked so small in that bed, smaller than I had ever seen him. His skin hung loose, his lips cracked, his once commanding voice reduced to shallow whispers. Caleb was already there, of course, sitting by his side, holding his hand like the son of the year. They looked like a perfect picture, one I had been cropped out of my whole life. But when my father's tired eyes found mine, I saw something I had never seen before. Not pride, not love, but fear. And in that moment, I realized there were things about him, about us, that I still didn't know. Things he had buried for decades, things that were about to come crashing into the light. The first minutes in that hospital room felt like an out-of-body experience. Caleb glanced at me briefly, his eyes cold and guarded, before he shifted his chair closer to Dad's bedside, as if to make clear that he was the rightful heir to that position. For so long, I had told myself I didn't care, that I had learned to stand on my own. But standing there in that sterile room, I felt like a child again, unwanted, unseen, wishing someone would move aside and make room for me. I pulled another chair closer anyway, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it echo in my ears. Dad's breathing rattled, and when he tried to speak, the words broke into jagged fragments. Caleb leaned in immediately, translating every syllable as if he alone had the right to interpret my father's last thoughts. "He's saying he wants his lawyer called," Caleb muttered, and I felt my stomach twist. Even on his deathbed, my father was thinking about paperwork, about money, about control. But then something shifted. His hand, the same hand that had pushed me away all my life, lifted weakly from the blanket, trembling as it reached out toward me. For a moment, I thought he might be trying to grasp my hand. I hesitated, then slipped mine into his. His skin was thin as paper, his grip fragile but insistent. His lips moved again, and though the sound was faint, I heard it. I swear I did. A whisper that barely existed in the air, but pierced me all the same. "Lila." It was the first time I had heard my name in his voice in years. Caleb froze, his jaw tightening. He looked at me with a mixture of irritation and something else I couldn't place, panic. Maybe. My father's eyes flicked between us, clouded with something like regret, and for the first time in my life, I wondered if Caleb had been holding more than just my father's hand all these years. Had he been holding on to secrets too? Over the next few days, I stayed at the hospital, unwilling to let the moment slip through my fingers. The nurses came and went, the machines hummed, and each day, Dad grew weaker. Caleb insisted on handling all the important matters, but I began to notice small cracks. Late at night, I caught him slipping out of the room with folders tucked under his arm. Once, I overheard a hushed phone call. "She doesn't need to know. Just wait until he's gone." My heart sank. I had always believed Caleb was simply the favorite, the one Dad adored, while I was left behind. But now, standing on the edges of their conversations, I realized something darker was at play. Caleb wasn't just favored. He was hiding something. And my father, my cold, unloving father, looked at me with eyes that seemed to beg for something I didn't yet understand. One night, when Caleb finally went home to rest, I sat alone by Dad's bedside. His chest rose and fell in uneven waves. I leaned closer and whispered, "Why me, Dad? Why was I never enough? What did I do to make you hate me?" My voice cracked, years of swallowed pain spilling out in raw sobs. To my shock, his eyes fluttered open. He stared at me with such intensity, it felt like a hand squeezing my chest. His lips moved, forming words that sent a shiver down my spine. Not hate. Protect. I froze. Protect me from what? His frail hand gripped mine again, more desperate this time, his nails digging lightly into my skin. He coughed violently, and I called for a nurse, but even as the nurse rushed in, he wouldn't let go of me. His gaze burned into mine, pleading, as if he needed me to understand before it was too late. When the nurse finally eased him back into rest, I sat there shaken. Protect. The word repeated in my head louder with every echo. For decades, I had believed I was unloved, unwanted. Could it be that the truth was more complicated? Could it be that my father's distance was not rejection, but a shield against something or someone I hadn't seen? The next morning, Caleb returned smug and composed, but I noticed the faint bags under his eyes, the edge of paranoia in his movements. He snapped at the nurses, insisted on reading every document before anyone else touched it. And when he caught me watching, he gave me a smile so sharp it felt like a warning. Something inside me hardened then. Maybe for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let Caleb control the narrative. If my father had secrets, if there was something buried in this family that explained decades of silence and pain, I would uncover it. I owed that much to myself. I owed that much to my father's last trembling attempt at honesty. But I had no idea that the truth, once revealed, would change everything. I thought I knew not only about my father, but about Caleb, about my mother, about myself. The truth began to unravel in fragments like threads tugged loose from a tapestry I had been staring at my entire life, without realizing how frayed it really was. It happened 2 nights later. I had fallen asleep in the stiff chair by Dad's bed, the sound of machines and his shallow breaths lulling me into uneasy dreams. When I woke, the room was dim, except for the faint glow of the monitors. Caleb wasn't there. I rubbed my eyes, glanced around, and noticed the drawer of the bedside table slightly open. Something about it felt strange. Caleb was meticulous, obsessive about order. I reached out and slid the drawer fully open. Inside, there were papers, envelopes, a small black notebook. My fingers shook as I pulled it out. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably my father's. I didn't mean to pry, I told myself that at first, but once my eyes caught the words, I couldn't stop. Lila can never know. Not yet. She's safer if she believes I don't love her. If I push her away, she'll stay out of Caleb's reach. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, reading it again, unsure if my tired mind was twisting the words. Safer, out of Caleb's reach. Page after page, I found the same tortured refrain. He is not the boy she thinks he is. His mother encouraged it, told him he was entitled. I failed her when I should have told her the truth. I pressed my hand over my mouth bile rising in my throat. All my life, I thought my father's distance was proof that I was unworthy of his love. But in these pages, I saw another story, a father who believed the only way to protect his daughter was to deny her closeness. A man who thought rejection was safer than intimacy, because intimacy would expose her to Caleb's shadow. And Caleb, what had he done? I nearly dropped the book when the door creaked open. Caleb stepped in, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the room. He saw the notebook in my hands, and his face hardened. Put that back. He hissed, his voice low but venomous. I clutched it tighter. What is this, Caleb? What was Dad protecting me from? He shut the door behind him, moving closer, his smile curling in that way I had always hated. You wouldn't understand, Lila. You never could. You were too busy playing the victim while Dad built everything for me. He knew I was strong enough to carry the family name. You were just a liability. His words stung, but the notebook burned in my hand like a weapon. He wrote that he was protecting me from you. For a split second, Caleb's mask slipped. His eyes flashed with something raw, dangerous. Then he laughed, a sound so cold it sent a chill down my spine. And you believed him? That bitter old man who couldn't even admit what a failure you were? He pit us against each other, Lila. And you ate it up. I wanted to scream at him, but before I could, Dad stirred in the bed. His eyes fluttered open, and for once they locked on me with sharp clarity. His voice rasped, but it carried weight. Enough. Caleb froze. I leaned closer, clutching Dad's frail hand. He squeezed mine weakly, his eyes never leaving mine. You are my daughter. He whispered each word, trembling with effort. My throat tightened, tears spilling down my face. Finally, after 37 years, the word I had ached to hear. Caleb stepped forward, panic etched across his features. Dad, don't. But my father cut him off with a wheezing breath. I should have told you sooner, Lila. I kept you at a distance, to keep you safe. Caleb isn't who you think he is. The room fell into heavy silence. Caleb's jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists. For the first time, I saw him not as the favored golden child, but as a man cornered, terrified of what might be revealed. The monitor beeped rapidly, Dad's chest rising with shallow gasps. Nurses rushed in, and Caleb stepped back, his face pale with fury. I stumbled out into the hallway, the notebook still clutched in my trembling hands. My father's words echoed in my ears, to keep you safe. Safe from what? Safe from whom? That night, I read the rest of the notebook alone in my car. The final pages left me shaking. My father had discovered things about Caleb embezzled funds from the family business manipulations that drove my mother to exhaustion, threats whispered in moments of anger. He had wanted to confront him, but my mother, always desperate to preserve appearances, begged him to bury it, to let Caleb have everything, to keep peace. And so he had tried to protect me the only way he knew how, by turning his love into a wall I couldn't climb. But the wall was crumbling now, and beneath it lay a truth that demanded to be faced. The morning after I read those final pages, I walked into the hospital with fire in my chest. My entire life had been built on lies, my father's silence, my mother's complicity, Caleb's careful manipulation. I had spent years carrying the weight of rejection, when in truth, the rejection was meant as armor. And now, standing in that sterile hallway with the notebook pressed to my chest, I knew I couldn't let Caleb walk away with everything. Not after what I'd uncovered. When I entered Dad's room, the air felt heavier, as if even the machines sensed the end was near. His breathing was labored, his body sinking further into the bed. Caleb was there, of course, pacing with a stack of papers in his hands. He looked up at me with irritation. You shouldn't be here, he snapped. This isn't your business. Something inside me broke then, but not in the fragile way it used to. This break was sharp, jagged, and it carved through the years of silence. I stepped closer, holding the notebook out. You mean this isn't my business? The one where Dad wrote about all the things you've done? All the lies you've told? Caleb's face went pale. His mouth opened, then shut like he was scrambling for the right mask to put back on. You don't understand what you're holding, he said finally, his voice low, threatening. I felt my hands shake, but I didn't back down. No, Caleb. For the first time, I actually do. Dad kept me at arm's length because he was afraid of you. And now, I know why. Dad's eyes opened, then weak but alert. He turned his head toward me with immense effort, his lips trembling as he whispered, Tell her. Caleb moved quickly, leaning over the bed, clutching Dad's wrist. Don't, Dad. You'll just confuse her. You need to rest. But my father's gaze stayed locked on me, fierce, despite the frailty of his body. Not her fault, he rasped. His hand slipped from Caleb's grip and found mine instead. His touch was weak but desperate, as if passing me something more important than words. Daughter, forgive me. The word daughter shattered something deep inside me. My chest tightened, sobs rising before I could stop them. He had never said it before, never allowed himself to give me that title. And now, with his last breaths, he gave it to me like a final gift. Caleb's face twisted with rage. He ripped his hand through his hair, pacing the room. "You're ruining everything," he shouted at the frail man who had once been his idol. His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked like a child again, terrified of losing control. But then, his eyes snapped back to me, dark and venomous. "You think you've won something here, Lila? You haven't. You don't know how to handle this family. You don't deserve it." I gripped the notebook tighter, my tears drying into resolve. "I deserve the truth, Caleb. That's all I ever wanted. And whether you like it or not, Dad wanted me to have it too." Before Caleb could respond, the monitors let out a shrill alarm. My father's chest heaved, his eyes widening before they began to dim. Nurses rushed in, pushing us aside, but his hand clung to mine until the very last second, until his body finally went still, and then he was gone. The room filled with chaos. Doctors, nurses, machines, but I stood frozen, numb, still feeling the ghost of his grip on my hand. The last word he had given me echoed through my bones. "Daughter." Caleb stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass. I stayed staring at my father's still form, torn between grief and a strange, hollow peace. After a lifetime of silence, he had spoken. Too late, perhaps, but still, it was enough to make me believe he had loved me in his own twisted, broken way. Later that week, when the will was read, the shock rippled through the room. Against every expectation, my father had left the bulk of his estate to me, not to Caleb. The house, the business shares the savings. Caleb's face turned scarlet as the lawyer read the words, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "This is a mistake," he growled, slamming his fist on the table. "He would never do this. She manipulated him at the end. But the lawyer cut him off, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your father left a letter with his instructions. It's addressed to Lila." I opened it with trembling hands. The words were shaky, scrawled by a dying man, but they were clear enough. "Lila, my silence was my greatest sin. I thought I could protect you by pushing you away, but all I did was wound you. Forgive me. Take this chance to build the life I should have given you. Do not let Caleb's anger consume what's left of this family. Remember always you were and are my daughter." Tears blurred the ink as I read it aloud. Caleb stormed out, cursing, his footsteps echoing down the hall. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of being truly seen, but the victory was bittersweet. My father's love had come too late, wrapped in secrets and regrets, and my brother's hatred was far from over. The days after the funeral were a blur of condolences, paperwork, and long, empty nights where I couldn't sleep for hearing his last words over and over again. Daughter. That single word had rewired something in me, but it didn't heal everything. In fact, it seemed to split me in two, part of me finally vindicated, part of me drowning in grief for the years I would never get back. Caleb, meanwhile, became a storm I couldn't escape. He showed up at the house more than once, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. I could see the rage in his face, the way he clenched his jaw like a man holding himself back from violence. "You don't deserve any of this," he shouted through the door one night. "You're nothing without me." Dad knew it, Mom knew it, everyone knew it. But then his voice dropped lower, more sinister. "He ruined me, Lila, and now I'll ruin you." I pressed my back against the door, trembling, every muscle tense. I thought of calling the police, but when the silence finally came, I only heard his car peel away into the night. Still, the threat lingered like smoke in my lungs. I buried myself in Dad's notebooks, the scraps of truth he had left me. Piece by piece, I uncovered the depth of Caleb's betrayals. Embezzled funds, backroom deals, even whispers of coercion that had broken my mother down. And worse, there were hints of things left unsaid, half-finished sentences about danger and control. My father hadn't just been trying to protect me from jealousy or favoritism. He had been protecting me from a man whose soul had rotted long ago. The anger inside me began to sharpen. For years I had lived in the shadow of their bond, believing I was the unworthy one. But now, the truth was clear. Caleb's power was built on lies, and my silence had been his weapon. If my father's last gift to me was the truth, then I would not squander it. I started with the business. My father's shares had come to me, and when I walked into that office for the first time as majority owner, Caleb was waiting. He leaned against the conference table, arms crossed, his smile mocking. "Look at you," he sneered, "pretending you belong here. You'll fold in a month without me." I stood taller than I felt, holding his gaze. "Funny, Caleb. That's exactly what Dad wrote you would say." The color drained from his face just for a second, but it was enough. I laid the notebook on the table, open to the pages where Dad had detailed Caleb's misdeeds. The other board members leaned in, eyes widening as the words sank in. Caleb's mouth opened and closed, fury boiling just beneath his skin. "You think this will save you?" He spat, his voice trembling. "You think you're better than me now." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. For once, the silence wasn't mine to carry, it was his. In the weeks that followed, Caleb's downfall was swift. Investigations opened, allies turned cold, and his carefully built facade began to collapse. He lashed out at me with threats, with desperate attempts to claw back control, but every time I held my ground. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of my father's trust, his final words giving me a spine I never knew I had. And yet, even as victory settled around me, the hollow ache remained. I had won, yes. I had claimed the truth and stripped Caleb of his lies. But none of it could give me back the years I lost waiting for a father's love that had been there all along, twisted by fear and silence. One night, I sat on the porch of the old family house, the autumn air crisp against my skin. I held the letter he had written me, running my fingers over the ink, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. "You were and are my daughter," I whispered into the dark as if he could hear me still. "I forgive you, Dad, and I'll carry your truth with me." In that moment, I realized forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain, it was about freeing myself from it. Caleb could rage and burn all he wanted, but I was done living in his shadow. My story is not just about betrayal or revenge. It's about the wounds we carry, the lies that shape us, and the moments of truth that come too late but still matter. It's about finding your voice after a lifetime of silence and daring to call yourself worthy even when no one else will. And if you're listening, if you've ever felt unseen or unloved by the very people who should have protected you, I want you to know this: you are not defined by their silence. You are more. You always were. So if my story touched you, please share it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me your story, your truth. Because sometimes the act of speaking it aloud is the first step toward healing.